Welcome everyone to Fáilte Mhór Roimh Gach Duine. Welcome to this conference on the future of housing in Europe. It's my great pleasure as the head of the law school at NUI Galway to be chairing the conference today. So I'm looking forward to what I'm sure will be a very interesting day. We're very grateful to all the speakers who have given their time to be with us today, and we hope that those watching will find this a very stimulating and interesting conference programme.
Good morning, Díomh Gallair. I'm delighted to join you for this Conference on the Future of Europe event, focusing on the issue of housing. I want to thank you for taking the time to attend the event and for agreeing to share your views on this important topic and how it might be best addressed and prioritised within our European Union. I want to give thanks as well to Professor Kenna and the team at the Centre for Housing, Law, Rights and Policy at the National University of Ireland, Galway, for facilitating this discussion. The Conference on the Future of Europe is an unprecedented opportunity for citizens all over Europe to make your voices heard about the future direction of our Union. We will only derive full value from an exercise of this kind if we have a wide and inclusive range of voices, taking part in a discussion that examines those issues that hold the greatest significance for Europe's citizens. Housing, and especially the challenges that Europe and Ireland's young people in particular face in obtaining a sustainable home, it's arguably a prime example of one such issue, and undoubtedly the case here in Ireland. Housing, of course, isn't an EU competence, but it's not wrong to say that Europe can play a role in helping us to navigate issues within the broader area. Taking stock of where we are in late 2021, a serious reflection on where Europe is headed is clearly warranted in light of all that has happened in the past decade. The European Union has had to navigate several major challenges, including the financial crisis and the associated impact, of course, on the housing market in Ireland, the migration crisis, the UK's departure from the EU, and most recently, of course, the pandemic. COVID-19 required Europe to confront a once-in-a-generation public health crisis. While the past 20 months have required sacrifices of all groups in society, certain groups have had to withstand a particularly challenging time. Given that the pandemic has required us all to spend far greater levels of time in our homes than ever before, this experience has thrown into sharp relief the importance of accommodation that meets the needs of families and households. As we think about the aftermath of COVID-19 and how we can fashion a strong and equitable post-pandemic economic recovery across the Union, how best to address the social and economic needs of all following this transformative event, that must be a key question. Through the pillar of social rights, the European Union is taking the initiative to support Member States to improve social protections in a number of areas, including housing and actions to help the homeless. I would be keen to learn if participants in today's discussion believe that the Europe of the future should include more policies in this vein. The urgency of the climate crisis that we face has increased resonance, not least as the recent weeks has seen the world's attention turn to the COP26 summit in Glasgow. It's clear, of course, that unless Europe and the world takes action today, society in the decades to come will be forced to contend with significant added challenges. The conference has a major role to play in contributing to conversations about the best EU response to climate issues at an everyday level. I am sure many of you will have concrete suggestions about how Europe can be proactive in this area. It's essential that our transition to a greener future in areas like energy and housing is a just and fair one. This includes ensuring those more vulnerable groups who may be less well equipped to shoulder the adjustment, that they are supported and that they receive the necessary solidarity in navigating the change. EU membership has been hugely transformative for Ireland as a nation, no one can argue with that. But in much the same way, the European Economic Community that we joined in 1973 is very different from the vibrant, diverse and multicultural EU that we're part of today. As we look ahead to the 50th anniversary of Ireland joining the EU in 2023, it's timely that we reflect on the type of Europe we want to foster in the next half-century and the key role Ireland will play in this process. Nevertheless, I think it's important to acknowledge that not all groups in society have shared equally in this progress, and they continue to encounter obstacles in fulfilling some essential needs. Certain communities, not least our young people, can encounter particular challenges, of course, serious challenges about housing. So it's essential that we continue to try to deliver the necessary strategies and supports to alleviate this. Events like today are very useful to help us consider what role the EU can play in this process and meeting needs in the years ahead. As Minister for European Affairs, I really want to hear all perspectives on the European Union, what it means for us here in Ireland, and what future direction we think it should take. Today, therefore, is about you and your views. To date, I've participated in the first 2 of the conference plenaries in Strasbourg, virtually, and I will partake in several more of these gatherings in the months ahead. Plenaries are a very good opportunity to hear how other member states, national parliaments and social partners are approaching the conference. The plenaries to come will see us examine ideas that are emerging from citizens' discussions across Europe. So events like today form part of the Irish view that feeds into future meetings of the conference plenary via reporting submitted to the conference's digital platform. Indeed, I hope that your participation in today's event in NUIG might inspire you to consider organising your own Future of Europe event, big or small. One of the key advantages of the conference process is that anybody can take the initiative to do this and upload a report on their discussion to the digital platform that then forms part of the conference's larger conversation. It's important that as many people as possible have their voices heard during this process and that their opinions on the EU, positive and negative, are heard. Events such as today's seminar will form part of the Irish view that feeds into future meetings of the conference plenary via the reporting that is on the digital platform. That in turn helps contribute to a consensus report, which is based largely on the proceedings of the plenary and the citizens panel. This report then goes to the Presidents of the Council, the Parliament and the Commission for consideration and follow-up action. So I hope you realise that we all have an opportunity here now to review what the EU is doing and for it to go through the process and for those ideas, if they form part of the consensus, to end up in the conclusions of this process. We know that the EU has an impact on our daily lives. There are areas where it may potentially do better. So I invite you today to share your views on how we might best achieve this. So I wish you all the best for your discussions today. Donnery go Gilliland leis an tí spóireachta inniu, agus gur míle maith go bhfuil.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those opening words, particularly for the encouragement for everybody watching to contribute to this debate and feed into the ongoing discussions within Europe on this important issue. I think that will be taken to heart by all those listening today. I'd like now to pass to our next speaker, and that is Noel O'Connell, who has been the CEO of the European Movement Ireland since April 2011 and is Vice President of the Board of the European Movement International. Noel is also the National Citizens Representative for Ireland on the Conference of the Future of Europe plenary meetings at the European Parliament. So over to you, Noel.
And since our foundation 7 decades ago, practically at this stage, European integration has resulted in an enhanced expectation and reliance on universal values and fundamental rights that are an integral part of living in the EU. And as enshrined in the Treaty on European Union, the Union itself is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. These values are common to the member states in a society which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves of that and reminding the institutions on the EU and the member states of those fundamental founding values. And the human rights are also protected by the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which cover the right to be free from discrimination on the basis of sex, racial or ethnic origin, religion or belief, disability, age or sexual orientation, the right to protection of your personal data, and the right to get access to justice. Beyond these fundamental rights, however, we have seen how the EU has helped bring about stability and contributed to raising the living standards for so many of its citizens across what is now, post-Brexit, the 27 member states. The removal of border controls, and these are sometimes rights and privileges that we take for granted, but that removal of border controls has allowed people to travel freely without visas, trade without tariffs, and work without permits. As members of the EU, we enjoy the right and the freedom to choose which EU member state we want to work, study, or retire. And every member state must treat EU citizens in exactly the same way as its own citizens when it comes to matters of employment, social security, and tax. While so much has been achieved by the EU since its foundation, we arrive at the conference on the future of Europe, as Minister Byrne outlined, at a time, it's fair to say, when Europe faces many challenges, internally and externally. These include economic issues, security and defence, climate crisis, digitalisation, health, and in all these matters, reflection, but also proactive engagement and action is required. And as the Minister outlined, 2022 is a very significant year because on the 10th of May 1972, the country took to the polls and voted overwhelmingly in favour of our EEC accession. And next year, we mark and celebrate 50 years of that. So today, this conference that you are participating in represents an important opportunity to give our opinions on the future direction of the EU and be involved in shaping and influencing it. And on today's topic of housing, and really want to pay tribute to Professor Kenna on this, it has been in the spotlight, but it is a case that is often repeated and witnessed as we see in other member states. People are encountering increasing difficulties in securing decent housing. And how do we reflect on this as part of the conference on the future of Europe? Lone parents, ethnic minorities, and a range of people and families across the EU are finding that the securing of their own home is becoming increasingly out of reach for many, particularly for our younger people. Whilst the EU holds limited responsibility in the area of housing policy, and that must be acknowledged, I think that this conference on the future of Europe could be a moment and an opportunity that change can arise, because the unique space provided by the conference, it allows for conversations and discussions like today about the future of housing within the EU. And this is a major policy challenge which is common across all member states. But how can the EU as a collective respond and act and add value to this debate? And that's where today your deliberations really matter and count. So in terms of the conference on the future of Europe here in Ireland, what is it about? For us here in European Movement Ireland, we are working very closely with the Minister and the Department of Foreign Affairs in carrying out national events. And our goal is to create a set of proposals based on the feedback that accurately reflect the opportunities, the challenges, the hopes, the wishes for our shared European Union identified by people living across the island of Ireland, and indeed our Irish diaspora abroad and beyond. I think the Minister has played a crucial role in supporting and driving this work alongside colleagues and officials in the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of the Taoiseach, and the institutions in terms of the European Commission and the European Parliament. And as well, a lot of credit is due to members of the Oireachtas involved in this process for driving and promoting it as well. So over the last number of months, we have conducted a broad and open, inclusive set of discussions about the future of Europe. We have virtually travelled across the island of Ireland and really looked to encompass a diverse set of voices from across the different regions, north and south, those who have made Ireland their home and those of the Irish in Europe and beyond. And people have been coming together to share their ideas and their views and their vision for that future. Young people, minorities, islanders, Irish language organisations, cross-border communities. And really, we have been working really closely to try and work with people who don't always feel that they are heard in discussions around Europe. And then we are working with academia to develop these ideas into actionable positions that are a genuine, authentic representation of Ireland's vision for Europe's future. There has been a key trend emanating from these discussions of people wanting the EU to do more in many areas that impact their daily lives, e.g., providing supports around future pandemics, the digital transition that is fair and equitable and ensures no one is left behind, to greater adherence to environmental rules and the rule of law. From our perspective, it has been absolutely inspiring and fascinating to hear the perspectives of so many people engaging in this process. And if you have not had an opportunity already, I would encourage you to visit the conference's main website, where to date, I think they're saying about 4 million people have visited and have generated 9,000 ideas for the future of Europe. So I would really encourage you all to have a look, to get involved and have your say and upload the findings and the outcomes of today's conference. It is a process that, and I really want to reiterate this, that does not belong to any one politician or any one institution, but it belongs to all of us in the European Union. And in my role as CEO of EM Ireland, we're really looking forward to continuing our work on the conference of the future of Europe going into next year. And wearing my national citizen representative hat, really looking forward to continue to articulate and advocate on behalf of all of us here in Ireland on the Conference of the Future of Europe. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you here today, and I wish you well on your future deliberations for today's conference. Gur míle maith agóibh go léir.
And good morning, everyone, particularly to our attendees today. As Martin has indicated, there we have 3 fantastic speakers for this session. We're going to focus on financing affordable housing and equal access, particularly that of gender equality. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first contributor, to Kim. And Kim, you have 10 minutes. And I'm going to be really strict with the clock to allow questions and answers afterwards. So over to you, Kim.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much also for the invitation. And I think it's great that you have dedicated this event to housing, because, you know, it's a very important topic. And I'm also very happy because it's a topic dear to my heart. So we've seen, you know, in the pandemic, how important a safe, healthy and comfortable home really is. People were asked to shelter in place and to work from home. And the pandemic has in the first place put a spotlight on the housing crisis in Europe. And from Warsaw to Athens, Dublin to Lisbon, more and more people simply can't afford a decent home anymore. And throughout the EU, housing prices have risen 7% in the last year. And in my own country, the Netherlands, housing prices even went up with 16%. And this while people have very often seen their income drop, in particular people on flexible and precarious contracts have suffered. And for them, like, owning their own house is often a utopian idea, while rents also keep on steadily rising faster than income. And also the quality of a lot of houses is poor. We have damp houses with poor insulation, which have severe impact on health, particularly for children. And a lot of people also live in houses that are simply too small for their families. With education going online as well, this overcrowding became even more problematic. And homelessness has been steadily increasing for the last decade. On estimate, 700,000 people sleep in the street or in shelters every single night. And we have to move from the current default approach of ignoring, managing, or criminalizing homelessness to solving it through housing-based solutions. The housing crisis manifests itself in the first place in large cities. In cities like Lisbon, entire neighborhoods turned into ghost towns in the pandemic because tourists didn't come anymore. And this shows how much housing was actually used to accommodate tourists instead of providing a home to people living, working, and studying in the city. And what we're seeing is that the rules of the market right now prevail. Governments have stopped investing in social housing and have actively invited financial investors onto their housing markets. More and more money flows into the housing market, and less people can actually afford a home. Clearly, something isn't right. And it's often the younger generations that are paying the price, turning them into generation rent. But housing is a human right, guaranteed internationally, at EU level, and in a lot of countries in the Constitution. And this should be the starting point of our housing policy. To progressively realize the right to housing, we need to rein in the market forces and have the government take back control, because houses are for people, not for profit. At the beginning of this year, the Parliament adopted my report on decent and affordable housing for all. And this report puts housing as a human right central. I hope this can be the start of a shift of minds at the European level. And the report also recognizes that the EU has been too absent when it comes to housing. And whilst the EU will not build homes, a lot of EU policies have a major impact on the development of housing. We know that the Capital Markets Union rules for banks, insurers, pension funds have worked as a fire accelerator for the financialization of the housing market. We also see that the current fiscal rules are putting limits on how much governments can invest in housing. And with the European semester, we actually have a powerful tool to steer economic and social policies, such as housing. But the Commission, for example, has been recommending for years to shrink the Dutch social housing sector. And since the financial crisis, we have an average annual investment gap in affordable, energy efficient and social housing of 57 billion euros per year. So we need to urgently close this gap. Investments in social housing are also being limited by the state aid rules that are too restrictive on who the government can provide housing for. And these rules need to be changed. The EU can make a real difference, also in housing renovation. We know massively investing in housing renovation is good for the climate and jobs, but it also can get people out of energy poverty and into decent homes by focusing efforts on social housing and on the least energy efficient houses. And I welcome the renovation wave that was announced by the European Commission, and in particular, the Affordable Housing Initiative that focuses on social housing. A deep renovation of 3% of the European building stock per year, improving the energy performance of these buildings by at least 60%, can create 2 million jobs. And these elements should all be part of a coordinated approach to affordable and social housing at the EU level. A concrete proposal is, for example, that the ECOFIN ministers have to meet to discuss the surge in housing prices and rent, as they have also recently discussed the rising energy prices. But since the adoption of the report, we see that some important steps have already been taken. In June, all member states adopted the Declaration on Homelessness, and it's now firmly on the agenda of the EU with a common objective to end homelessness by 2030. We are not there yet, but we need to set ambitious goals when it comes to social justice. And the Commission has also announced that it's working on rules for short-term rental platforms. And here we need strong data sharing obligations so that cities can implement and enforce their rules. And of course, the EU can only do so much. And a lot of housing policy is not in our hands. Governments and cities need to put in place better rent regulation, urban planning, favoring affordable housing, higher taxes on vacant buildings, stricter rules for transparency on home ownership. And well, I mean, I guess I can go on for a while. But, you know, we are in an interesting moment, and the fight for decent and affordable housing for all is all but over. But I'm very hopeful because people are letting their voices be heard all over Europe, and it gets higher on the agenda. In Berlin, the referendum on the largest landlord showed that people want the current model of speculation and financialization that needs to be changed. And in the Netherlands, 10,000s of people took to the streets in many cities to demand that houses are for people and not for profit. I will continue working to translate the struggle from the streets and the work of the many wonderful NGOs and activists I've worked with in the last 2 years into policy. And I'm very happy also to hear from you what you think the EU needs to do when it comes to housing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. Really pertinent points there on housing as the provision of safe, secure, affordable home, a right, as opposed to the commodification to be traded back and forward for profit that we're seeing. And the intersection there of the financial rules and regulations really add to that tension. But I'm glad you ended on a message of hope. And I think you're part of that hope and the work you're doing. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Sharon Donnery, and Sharon actually is going to speak directly to that financial rules and regulations piece. So Sharon, over to you for your 10 minutes contribution.
And now, as you heard a little bit from Kim there a moment ago, challenges related to the housing market, particularly around access and affordability, are well known, of course, here in Ireland, but those challenges are not unique to Ireland and can also be found across Europe and indeed further afield. But before I turn to that, reflecting that this event is part of the Conference on the Future of Europe, let me just take a brief moment to say a few words about the role of the Central Bank of Ireland in Europe. And because, of course, the bank is deeply embedded in the institutional framework of the European Union and the euro area through, for example, the governor's membership of the Governing Council of the European Central Bank, our collaboration on supervision through the single supervisory mechanism, and through our ongoing engagement with the European supervisory authorities and the European Systemic Risk Board. And I think for us, engaging effectively with our European colleagues and peers is key to achieving our own goals. And indeed, being open and engaged more generally is a theme of our recently published strategy for the coming years. And the reason for this is because we want to build trust and understanding in the role of the central bank through stronger engagement with the public, stakeholders and our peers. And I'd really like to thank the organisers for giving me the opportunity to do just that today. Now, housing affordability pressures appear to be a challenge facing many regions globally. Just last month, the European Central Bank published their most recent financial stability review. We can see this on the next slide, noting that house prices across the euro area rose at their fastest pace since 2005 in the second quarter of 2021. The report noted that despite the recovery in residential construction, labour shortages, global supply chain bottlenecks and input price increases are weighing on the construction sector's ability to expand housing supply, which is putting upward pressure on house prices. And in the Central Bank of Ireland, we highlighted how these issues are also affecting Ireland in our most recent financial stability review, which we published just a few weeks ago. Now, aside from the past few months, other Central Bank of Ireland research has also shown that a number of countries have seen house prices growing faster than incomes in recent years. While it's difficult to have consistent comparisons of the level of house prices relative to incomes across countries, our research does suggest that for a sample of advanced economies in recent years, relatively high levels of house prices to incomes have become a widespread phenomenon. This, of course, will not provide any great solace to those trying to purchase a home, but I do think it's important to place the Irish experience in this wider context. And these international trends do speak to the potential that global factors might also be contributing to developments in local housing markets. Our research also tried to assess housing costs across the population in the round, using a range of survey sources rather than focusing solely on house price and rental indices, which measure new transaction activity only. Focusing on the rental market, for example, costs are high in Ireland, and this impacts those with lower incomes particularly hard. In that context, our research has shown that in Ireland, there is a particularly high share of households that have subsidised rents. This likely, in part, explains why, across advanced economies, the share of lower income households, who have a very high rental burden in Ireland, does not appear to be materially out of line with other OECD countries. But of course, this doesn't take away from the very real challenges for the individuals that I mentioned earlier, particularly for new tenants, for whom rental costs have increased significantly in Ireland, and for those renting who may also be trying to save up for a deposit to purchase a home. Now, as we're discussing today, housing policy is a complex area where elected governments have a primary role to play. There are many actors in the housing market, including households, developers and investors, as well as governments and financial entities such as banks. But you may be wondering what role central banks have. So if we turn to the next slide, there are many important links to our primary role on price stability, but one particular area where central banks have a more direct role is overseeing the role that the financial system plays in the housing market. When someone wishes to purchase a home, they often need access to mortgage finance. And this intermediation is an important and valuable role that the financial system plays. However, this financial intermediation also entails risks that need to be managed for lenders, for borrowers, and for the entire economy. Because left unchecked, excessive risk-taking in the mortgage market can lead to financial instability, and indeed has done repeatedly through the course of history. So here at the Central Bank of Ireland, we have a specific mandate with respect to financial stability. And our overall aim is to ensure that the financial system can absorb rather than amplify adverse shocks, and that banks can continue to serve households and businesses through times of stress. Now, in the next slide, you'll see some of the key tools we have to achieve this aim, and these are called macroprudential policies. The policies have the most visible impact on the housing market are referred to as borrower-based measures. And it's fair to say that these policies have become common across Europe, particularly since the global financial crisis of 2007-2008. And here in Ireland, as many of you will know, we introduced our own mortgage measures in 2015. So for Europe, if we take the European Economic Area and the UK, 23 countries out of 31 have a so-called loan-to-value limit, which limits how much can be borrowed relative to the value of a property, while 17 countries, including Ireland, have a loan-to-income or debt service-to-income limit. Now, overall, these measures limit how large repayments on a loan can be with respect to a borrower's income. And the idea behind this is to link developments in the housing market to developments in people's real incomes, as well as to ensure that mortgages are at a lower risk of becoming unaffordable. In Ireland, our mortgage measures, which are described on the next slide, are integral part of our Irish macroprudential policy framework. And they have two objectives: to increase the resilience of banks and borrowers to negative shocks, and to prevent the re-emergence of a damaging credit house price spiral. Put more simply, our aim is that borrowers don't take on unsustainable amounts of debt, and banks don't give out unsustainable amounts of credit. This is so that through the highs and the lows of the economic cycle, the financial system is stable and sustainable, but importantly, can continue to serve the needs of the people of Ireland. The costs of not meeting these objectives were particularly clear during and after the previous financial crisis and can be seen on the next slide. The effects of the crisis in Ireland were particularly severe, with the unemployment rate increasing by over 10 percentage points to peak at about 16% in 2011-2012, while property prices fell by over 50% from their peak from 2007 to 2013. The financial crisis left significant scars across all segments of the Irish economy and society, some of which are still relevant today, including a legacy of individuals and households who remain in difficult situations with respect to mortgages that they drew down before the crisis.
1 minute, Sharon.
Now, I've previously outlined the rationale for borrower-based measures in economies, which I believe is clear. And the benefits of the mortgage measures were evident over the past year, as the resilience built up since their introduction helped to protect both borrowers and lenders during the COVID-19 crisis. However, in the central bank, we are acutely aware that the mortgage measures directly affect individuals and families, including their decisions about potentially purchasing a home. So given that we place the public interest at the heart of our policy approach, we are continuously trying to strike an appropriate balance between the benefits that the mortgage measures play in ensuring sustainable lending for housing and the potential costs that they impose across the economy. So having briefly discussed the role of central banks in the Irish housing market in a wider context, where should policymakers focus? Well, looking at the Irish housing market and considering whether there is enough supply to meet demand, I believe the answer is clear. Demand for housing is strong and supply has not kept pace. But I've said before that what is needed in housing markets is a sustainable level of supply. For central banks, our direct role relates to ensuring the sustainable provision of mortgage finance. Because the fact is that unsustainable levels of credit will not lead to a sustainable supply of new homes. If anything, it risks the re-emergence of a credit price spiral and another painful boom-bust housing cycle. The challenges facing the wider housing market around sustainability of supply and house price affordability would not be addressed by excessive indebtedness of households or imprudent lending. So overall, I think housing policy should focus on the sustainable supply of housing to meet the growing needs of citizens across Ireland and Europe. And the EU does have a role here, I think particularly around the green transition, for example, as existing homes will need to become more energy efficient to meet our climate change goals. However, tackling supply constraints will rightly remain primarily within the remit of national and even more so local policymakers.
Thank you.
So if we turn to my final slide, let me just briefly wrap up by saying every year since 2016, the central bank has reviewed our mortgage measures against their stated objectives. And we did this again just quite recently in 2021. But we're also currently in the process of doing something significantly different in parallel, which is an overarching review of the entire framework around our mortgage measures. At its core, this review will reflect the bank's mission to maintain monetary and financial stability. And the areas we focus on will be determined by listening to our stakeholders, lessons learned from experiences across the globe, and an assessment of the key changes in the housing market and the wider economic environment since we introduced the measures in 2015. Our decisions will ultimately be guided by extensive evidence-based analysis and the public interest. Many thanks for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for that very detailed presentation. I think it's very, very helpful to understand that. And the key message there around a balance of supply and demand into the future, a big, big challenge for us. Our final speaker is Michaela, coming from the city of Vienna. Michaela's going to talk a little bit about housing and gender. So again, 10 minutes, Michaela, and over to you. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure to be in Ireland, even if only virtually. And I'm really hoping forward to, repair this soon, because I need to go to Ireland again. It's a lovely country and with a lot of great and bright people. So really missing you. Okay, my task today was a little bit complicated in a way, because I was asked to reframe a little bit the whole issue of housing, the Future of Europe conference, and gender equality indeed, because when Patrick Kenna and I were in contact, we really felt that the gender dimension of the whole discussion, both in housing policies and in the Future of Europe debate, are a little bit, there's room to improve. So what I would like to do with you today, and if I could have my first slide, please. Coming from Vienna, typically you are, and working for the city, typically you are an urban feminist. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we are really hold up to take into account the gender dimension in all policy fields, and this since quite long. So when I listened now to Sharon, I was always asking myself, I'm sure you have that, but is there a difference, for instance, between women and men applying for loans, and how often are women rejected because of their smaller incomes by banks to get a loan? So these are questions that for me are, with regard to gender equality, really, really important also, where I do see a role for central banks to see into the policy of banks overall, as how women would be, able to get loans to set up a business, buy a home, whatever. So that was what was popping up as a question to Sharon already when I heard you. But coming back to a little bit to what do I do with you or to you today? I'd like to do a little bit of a feminist reframe. It's a little bit general, but we have 2021. And I think that when we discuss and debate and think about the future of our societies, whatever policy field we're discussing, it doesn't work if we do not if we do not take into account the half of humanity. If we see that half of humanity, and that's the women, the bigger part of humanity, remains invisible so often. Now I know that in the conference on the future of Europe, a lot is going on, but still, if you just would Google that, you would see that there is little explicitly done about women's rights and gender equality. Democracy, to start with the first thing, one number is interesting enough. There are more mayors in Austria called Joseph than women leading their local communities. And in Europe, the picture is even more awkward, because it's only 16% of mayors who are female, and only a third of all local councillors who are female. Now, we all know the numbers. More than half of the population is female. So we do not have a representativity in representative democracy here. And I'm very happy to have Alison Gilliland here, because as a Lord Mayor, you're the 10th, as I heard, in a long history of Lord Mayors of your city. Still in my city, Vienna, we didn't have any female mayors yet. Yeah. But I hope that this is something we can give as a vision to the next generation, at least. Now we also know, and this is something where I would wish also a stronger point with the conference on the future of Europe, clearly, that the only thing that can really change this is introduction of quotas. We've seen it in the example of the French departmental elections. Only 13% of all the elected representatives were female, like more than 10 years ago, but then they introduced a clear rule to have quotas for women, and they had half of the women, half of the representatives being women after that came in. So quota are, I think, the only thing that we need to implement that is necessary and that can help. And what we also see, even now with the change in Germany, one strong woman left as head of government. We have a new woman in Sweden now, but that means that of all the 27 EU member states, we only have 3 heads of government who are female. So if I can have the next slide, this was just to give you a little bit of a an appetite to discuss democracy also with a strong gender equality dimension from different angles. Now, when it comes to housing, I also want to put this in a bit of a bigger context, because very often we talk about housing and we talk of the construction or renovation of buildings. But what I think what we can learn also from Vienna, my city, is that you have to also reframe a little bit the context and talk about urban development and neighborhood development. We have seen that cities historically have been built according to the needs of those who are in power, and that mostly was the female population. We've seen that the public sphere is dominated by men, and I mean this literally when you look, for instance, at street names, square names. Who are the statues that our kids are maybe painting sometimes, but the statues in the public sphere? How many men, how many women? And if women, is it, you know, naked, maybe goddesses or beautiful statues, or is it representatives of the society? So look around in your city with open eyes, and then you will see the public sphere is dominated by men also in this very, very context. This is something we're trying to change very much in Vienna, especially when it comes to renaming the streets. But we also, if we go closer into the living environment of people, also homes. The architecture of flats is as well designed to reinforce and prolong gender stereotypes, meaning that there is a place for the woman, which is the kitchen, there is the representative space of the men, there is also a bigger, normally bedroom for the parents and smaller bedrooms for the kitchen. I just mentioned this because also on that, we have done a lot of work in Vienna in trying to reorganize the architecture so that it enables more equality in I would say in daily life. Yeah, we have also seen that homes have become really crucial in times of the pandemic. They became kindergartens, schools, workplaces, and I don't mention that. No, I mention it because that means that it tripled and quadrupled the burden that was on women, and it has also led to, sadly, to being very unsafe places when it comes to partner violence. And I remind everybody that we're still in the 16 days against gender-based violence now until the 10th of December. So this is why I mention it also today. So clearly, and again, talking about housing affordability, we have to see there is a gender dimension, because as long as we have this big gender pay gap and this big gender pension gap, we will have to see into that as well. It's a relation between incomes and costs. And there is a lot of also academic work going on that. So that means there is a clear gender dimension in housing affordability. The more this goes, as we see now, for the energy poverty. Energy poverty is really an issue because the rising energy prices, the inflation that we are seeing at the moment all over the place, is affecting women again to a much higher extent. So here we need to have more focus also on European level with regard to energy poverty. In the last new ruling about how to combat energy poverty of the European Union, there is no mention of gender inequalities. That's a pity, because a lot of also very, I wouldn't say this is the very progressive feminist NGO, it's the European Court of Auditors that recommends to the European Commission especially to take up more steps to engender their budget and to gender mainstream the EU budget. And in that context, I would say that there is, again, room to maneuver. Can I have my last slide, please? Now, coming to the Future of Europe conference, and I'll be quite brief, but a little bit bold again on that. Clearly, we've heard that in the beginning, the Conference of Europe should be a unique and timely opportunity for European citizens to debate on European challenges and priorities. Now, I don't see, and I must say this with great regret, that in my opinion, in my conviction, one of the biggest challenges Europe faces is rising gender inequality and a backlash to human rights. If you look at the conference events list, there is a very, very few events going, towards gender issues. Very often it's related to family issues again, reinforcing that stereotype that when you talk about families, you talk about women, and that's fine. It's not. Clearly, there's a little bit on employment and education. And I've only found one event related to housing, and this is today's event. So congrats at least to link that and to make the link also to women's rights. So what I would see, and that would be a role that I would like to have even stronger in the conference of on the future of Europe. There is no debate on institutional change. How can we empower citizens? How can we change a little bit to implement more gender equality via quota in the European Parliament's elections, for instance? There is really nothing going on in that field. As an urban person, as a city representative, I also would like to see how can we better involve cities and regions in EU decision making. That's another topic. And the other thing is, I think that we should also talk about women's rights related to the big instruments that we have now, like the EU Justice Scoreboard has already been mentioned, the EU rule of law mechanism. These important new mechanisms, everybody's talking about the rule of law, do not really have a gender equality dimension yet. So if we continue like we do at the moment, I think the future of Europe will not be feminist. And then we could just say, okay, maybe we should just start pay our daughters less pocket money than our boys, because that would make them, get used to the injustice of future income patterns for their lives. Or shouldn't we rather take an approach to empower and encourage them by giving them more female role models in politics, economy, and society, as we have seen in this panel? Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michaela. That was fantastic. And I think you hit the nail on the head there around our systems. They're designed around the male stereotype of going out to work and coming home in the evening, and the woman's in the house there, making dinner on the table and the children all looked after. And it's really hard to break that system. I am a fan of gender quotas. I think it's the only way forward, and we really have to actually increase them and strengthen them, not just in politics, but across company boards, institutions, all of that, until we eventually get that balance for better. So thank you for that. I have a few questions here. I have a comment from Kira, who says that many friends and family members are either delaying having children or deciding not to have children altogether because of the cost of housing, including herself. So we really need to see a drastic decrease in housing prices driven by an increase in housing supply. So that is a very pertinent comment, and I think it's one that has been captured in many reports, particularly by Task here in Ireland. Another question I have from Barbara is about rents. Rents in Ireland are now rising at an annual rate of 6.8%. The stock of homes to rent is between 70 and 80% lower than 1 year ago. And is it time to implement rent control and rent stabilization mechanisms in order to stop further speculation, inflation, and protect tenants? So you might hold that question. And I'm going to add in the question that you raised, Michaela, specifically for Sharon, men and women applying for mortgages. Do you have a gender data there, Sharon, and is there a trend? So those two questions about rents to Michaela, Kim, and Sharon, but also the specific one about mortgage applications on a gender perspective to you, Sharon. So Kim, I might go back to you on the rents there.
Well, I think when we're talking about rents, it's very important that we see it as a part of our life expenses, right? And I think for a long time we have agreed with each other that having, a quarter of your income or a third of your income to be spent on rent, but also energy, combination of that is something that we can agree on, but not more. But when we're looking at the average rent right now in Europe, we're reaching 40% or higher. And that is, and that means that all the other things, making sure you get food on the table, etc., has to go from that other part. And that is something that is indeed people, stalling people's development. It's stopping people from indeed taking big decisions because they simply can't save up money. And I think that is also the reason why we adopted generation rent. You have to pay so much rent that you can't save up to, in the end, have money enough to get a mortgage to buy a house. So you're just stuck in this vicious cycle. And I don't think, the utopia of, everyone having their own house is something that we have to strive for per se. There's plenty of people who prefer living in a rental home, but we have to, be realistic and say, okay, the rents are rising. It's not like something that's better. And actually, in many large cities in the Netherlands right now, it's cheaper to own a house, but people can't get out of the rental system because they have to pay so much money. So I think it's really important that we look at this. And I think in Europe, we have to strive for having lower rents and then really as part of the income. So try to strive, in my opinion, to go to the 25% of how much you spent on rent.
Yeah, we would have a similar case here in Ireland, Kim, where rent is higher than a mortgage. So Sharon, over to you about that gender piece on mortgage, but also that dichotomy around house ownership and striving to get a mortgage. In my view, here in Ireland, is because we don't have that secure, affordable rental system that should be public housing, but we're more depending on the market in Ireland and other countries like Holland.
Okay, thanks a lot for the questions. So on the gender issues, I don't have data to hand to explicitly answer Michaela's question, but I think her point in general is true. So we see very stark differences between men and women in the economy, for example, in labour force participation, in levels of average incomes, in things like gender pay gaps and so on. So we do see important differences economically, I think, across genders. Maybe the issue for the mortgage measures more specifically, though, is we do have this important system of exceptions where individual borrowers can look for an exception from the rules. And in that case, they're very specific on individual circumstances, including, for example, their own specific income and so on is taken into account as part of the process with the lenders when they're looking for a mortgage. On rental then, I think you mentioned, Lord Mayor, the point in the question about supply. So of course, rent controls can be an important part of the response to challenges in the rental market. But I think the part of the question that also referred to the decline in supply, I think is really key. And we have seen a very significant decline in supply in rents, particularly in urban areas, but of course more generally in Ireland as well. And as Kim mentioned, that's seen more across Europe. And I think that brings me back to this issue of a sustainable supply of housing. And as you rightly point out, in Ireland, there is a tendency, I think, to emphasise home ownership over rental. That's partly, of course, historical and partly cultural, but I think you're right, also partly to do with concerns about security of tenure and so on. So I suppose overall, it's about having, I think, joined up coherent policy, of course, that looks at these things in a sort of more sustainable way over a medium-term perspective, which, of course, I think is the reason why we're here in terms of talking about these issues. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Michaela, I'm not actually going to bring you in on this one. I'm going to give you a completely different question because I'm conscious of time. It's what do we do about Airbnb? And the potential long-term rentals that have been taken up by short-term rents of units that are promoting themselves as Airbnb. So maybe you could speak a little bit about your experience on that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think it's a very important point. And we have seen a whole movement of cities and regions, actually, across Europe just before the pandemic that was starting whereby local communities, local politicians try to protect their housing markets from this, I would say, touristification of their housing markets. And I think that, the pandemic stopped a little bit the business model of Airbnb, but it's coming back, as the colleague wrote in the question Q&A. So what I think is that we have seen now very good examples like in Paris, that really went against Airbnb until the Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice, and they said, okay, it's the court allows the city of Paris to protect their housing markets. And that's really a key decision at the moment on the European level. And what happens now is that a lot of cities and partners like Kim van Sparrentak in the European Parliament are now working together to have a new proposal of the Commission, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, to control those platforms and to give, cities back the right to know what's going on in their territories. And touristification is, just one part of the, I would say, devilish trinity that is called touristification, financialization, and gentrification. It's all one thing, and it's induced by global investment, basically. And we need to see that there has to be something done about it, because this is, again, creating those skyrocketing prices that we see in our markets.
Yeah, I think there was a stage in Dublin where we had more families living in hotels because they were homeless, and we had tourists in homes. And it just shows you the absolute perverseness of where we're at. Kim, you wanted to come in on that?
Yes, because it was announced quite recently that we're actually having a short-term holiday rental regulation coming up soon in the European Union. It will be published in March. And that is also very much thanks to the amazing work of all these big cities who told the Commission it's not okay that these platforms are taking over our city. We can't do anything about it. So I think that's amazing news. We now have a proposal for a Digital Services Act that will give enough provisions, hopefully, to make sure that Airbnb is, at least obliged to share some data with cities, and then we'll have a specific regulation to make sure that cities get, some power back over who owns their houses.
Okay, I'm going to end in one question for each of you. It's the same one, and it's around recognizing, I think we all recognize the challenges in this, but at a European level, in your view, what can and should be done to ensure more affordable, accessible, secure, long-term homes? And I go to you, Michaela, first.
No, but I would suggest the answer could be, first, acknowledge that we need more diversity in all our housing markets. Because at the moment we are discussing a very, I would say, limiting, also intellectually, limiting binary system, and that there is only home ownership, owner-occupied home ownership, and there's only rental. And mostly this is not true, because I'm coming from Vienna, and you have a big sector of public, municipal, cooperative housing. And I think that if the European Union would promote more of these more diverse solutions, we could really, really get out of the problem. I'm currently working, for instance, with the Association of Slovenian Cities, who want to set up a cooperative housing model. So a lot is going on to re-establish or to introduce these more participatory models of housing. And it's, if you don't like the word cooperative, because you are from post-communist tradition, then you can say co-housing, whatever. But we need these kind of models because they are financially sustainable. The money that is there is reinvested into the cooperative. It's a shared responsibility and it's shared also risks. And it's very little risky because it's super boring, long-term financial models. And I'm sure that Sharon loves these kind of models with regard to macroprudential economic behavior of them, So I think that this is one thing that we really should acknowledge. The European Union for long has only said housing is for social housing is only for the very poor and vulnerable groups. Look, go to Vienna. Go to Vienna and see people are proud to live in social housing. They are not ashamed to have an address that is connected to municipal building. So this is my first thing. And the second thing is, I think that we can do a lot to deblock investment in the EU's level, but I leave that to Kim now because with the time is running. Thank you.
Okay, before I go to Kim, I'll go to you, Sharon, on that same question.
Thank you. Maybe building on what Michaela said there are different parts or different subsectors of the housing market. So we talk generally about housing, but there are these important differences between home ownership, rental, social housing, and so on. From our point of view at the central bank, as I mentioned in my remarks, the financial system should not be here to serve the needs of the financial system itself. The financial system is here to serve the needs of the economy and to serve the needs of citizens. So I think one of the key contributions, of course, the European Union makes to the financial system is how it's regulated by central banks and regulators. And in thinking about how we regulate the financial system, I think it needs to be very much focused on the needs of citizens and achieving those in a way that's sustainable and provides for a stable economy. And in fact, the things that are mentioned here, like changing business models, Airbnb, digitalization, these kinds of things, these are also happening in the financial system. So we see massive changes in the financial system as a result of new innovation and so on. And a lot of that brings many positive things. But this, of course, also brings challenges for the economy and citizens. And again, there, I think regulation and so on has to also focus on making sure that the financial system meets the needs of citizens and that citizens and economies get what they need out of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, because I would be of the view that a stable, affordable housing system actually supports a stable economy, very much so. Kim, last word to you.
Thank you. Well, I'll just keep it short. I think, we have to start with acknowledging and treating housing as a human right. Because for so long, we're just counting on the market to solve everything. We're preferring, having money flow through the European Union for big investors to buy up houses, and we're totally neglecting the fact that there's people who have to live in those places and have to actually have a home. So I think that's where we have to start, treating it as a fundamental right. And from that lens, really look at all these points also that Michaela and Sharon mentioned. We have to change the financialization, and we have to stop using it as just an asset. We have to start treating housing as a fundamental right. And if we start doing that, I think a lot of good things can start happening.